Hi, I'm Julia Lupton. I'm co-director of UCI's Shakespeare Center, and I'm really delighted to have as my guest today Professor Seth Lerer, who's a distinguished professor of literature at UC San Diego.
Thank you, Julia. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be part of this unique teaching and research opportunity that you're working on. And as someone who was not trained as a Shakespearean, I was trained as a medievalist and as a historian of the English language. And coming to Shakespeare from that perspective gives me a sense of Shakespeare's relationship to his past and the way in which Shakespeare manipulates, coins, and reworks the vocabulary of his time. So it's a great pleasure to be able to share some of my interests and work with you and with the community.
It's really great to get a chance to talk with you about why you teach Shakespeare and what Shakespeare means in the present moment. I thought we could start actually with the First Folio. UCI has a copy and we use it a lot for community teaching and with undergraduates and graduate students. Why is the First Folio so important?
Well, it's a wonderful question. Most people, when you talk to them about the First Folio of Shakespeare, which for people who don't know what it is, it's the first collected set, not of Shakespeare's complete works, but of his plays. And it came out in 1623, 7 years after he died. And it is the single surviving early text for 18 of the plays. And so I think many people treasure the First Folio because it uniquely preserves some of the most famous and some of the most influential Shakespeare plays. But I think also what's exciting about looking at the First Folio, not just treasuring it as an icon, is the way in which it organizes the plays into comedies, histories, and tragedies. And within those groupings, how it orders them. So one of the interesting things about the First Folio that I think surprises a lot of people is that when you look at the group of history plays, let's say, they are not organized in the order in which they were written. They are organized in the order of their chronological subject matter. So they begin with King John in the Middle Ages, and they end with Henry VIII. And it is as if what you're getting is a dramatic retelling of English history, even though we know that Shakespeare wrote the Henry VI plays very early on, and that the Henry VIII play is very late and probably collaborative. So it's questions like that that motivate scholars and students to ask not just what the value of the First Folio is in preserving Shakespeare, but what happens when you read the First Folio.
Read the First Folio?
When you sit down and open it. So when you open it, you get an enormous amount of prefatory material from the publishers, from the editors, and from Shakespeare's friends and supporters, Ben Jonson, John Mabb, Hugh Holland, who write these dedicatory poems and dedicatory prefaces about Shakespeare. And then you get a list of the names of the actors who performed, and then you get the first play, which is The Tempest.
Why do you think the First Folio begins with The Tempest?
Well, there are two schools of thought on that, and I call them the smart school and the deliberately not smart school. The deliberately not smart school says that opening with The Tempest is a bibliographical issue, that it was a play that came to the publishers and editors in extremely good shape, that it was prepared by the scribe Ralph Crane, and that it required a minimal amount of proofreading and editorial work on the part of the editors. The smart version of it, by which I mean the version of that argument about content, involves the following. It used to be believed, the romantic fantasy was that The Tempest was Shakespeare's last play, that Prospero is Shakespeare saying farewell to the theater. and that this sentimentalized version of the Tempest makes it ideal as an introduction. Those readers who are interested in literary form would argue that the Tempest is one of Shakespeare's two plays, the other being the Comedy of Errors, that preserve what were called the unities of time and space. In other words, the Tempest play takes place in the time it takes to play it, and it takes place in one place. So if you are a classically minded reader or a formalist reader, you want Shakespeare to begin like that. And so really for the past century, scholars have been going back and forth on how meaningful it is. My view is that you have a printed book, and that whatever the motives may have been for the editors, the book came to its initial set of readers with a certain order. And that order had to be taken as meaningful because that was the way in which the set of plays came. And so one of the things that scholars are doing now is they're looking at actual copies of the First Folio to see if there are annotations or comments or markings by early readers that will give us a sense of how they responded to it. And I've done some work with some of these early copies, and it seems clear to me that for the group of readers of the 1620s and 30s, that first group of buyers and readers of the First Folio, the order was meaningful. That they read the plays, they used the book in the order, that they annotated in a particular order, and that sometimes their annotations refer back. In other words, that The Winter's Tale is the last of the comedies, and The Tempest is the first of the comedies. Again, these may be the accidents of editorial production, but they are presented to readers in a meaningful space. And so when you look at early annotations, or when you look at early volumes, it's fascinating to see how The Winter's Tale and The Tempest form a kind of natural pairing. They're both plays that are about the irrationality of male rule. Why does Prospero act in the way he does? Why does Leontes act in the way he does? They're both plays with extremely strong female characters. You have Miranda, you have Hermione, you have the Paulina, you have the characters in The Winter's Tale that raise important questions about what it means to be a wife or a daughter, as you see in The Tempest. And they're both plays that have a kind of magical, musical quality to them. There is an enormous amount of performance in The Tempest, an enormous amount of music. There's the mask, there's a great deal of playing. And in The Winter's Tale, similarly, there's a great deal of performance in the figure of Autolycus singing his ballads, and in the restorative music at the end of the play. And so what I would like to suggest to students, as well as to teachers and scholars, is that as you look at a document like the First Folio, what we should do is we should take very seriously what the editors, Hemming and Condell, said. And in their preface, what they said was, read him again. And what I think that means is that this is a book not just to be read, but it is a book to be reread. They said, but whatever you do, buy. The book cost 15 shillings when it first came out, which was a lot. And I think it's very clear that their intention is to have their readers reread. It's not simply a question of the First Folio reprinting texts that they would have already seen. It's really a sense that this is a book to be lived with. And for those of us who teach and value Shakespeare, it's fascinating to see how the differences we feel between reading the plays and watching the plays. And Shakespeare was very much a person of the theater, but he was also very much a person of the book. And I think the excitement of Shakespeare, especially today, is the excitement that all of us feel in juxtaposing these two experiences and not reconciling them, but living with two different ways of approaching Shakespeare, which in his own time also operated. The texts were there, the plays were there. Reading and watching are in many ways the two energies that we devote to Shakespeare. I think that what we should really do is take at face value the injunction of the editors of the First Folio, Hemming and Condell, who say in their preface, read him and read him again. It is this sense that the First Folio is a book to be lived with, to be read and read over. And as they say also in their preface, whatever you do, buy. It was 15 shillings in its own time, which was a lot of money, and anyone buying the book would have lived with it.
So you mentioned the musicality of The Tempest and The Winter's Tale, but there's music, of course, in the earlier plays as well. And so Midsummer Night's Dream obviously has a lot of lyric poetry, and it also has actual songs. Can you talk a little bit about the role that you see music playing? What would a Shakespearean audience have heard at either a court or a public performance? What are your thoughts about the musical soundscape?
It's a wonderful question because it's very clear from research in performance history that Shakespeare's plays and all of the theater of the Elizabethan and Jacobean period was a theater of multimedia. It was a theater that used sound and space, that used special effects. And in addition, as scholars have recovered, many of the performances of the plays, even the tragedies, would have ended with the actors returning for a dance or for a song or for a jig. And so I think we need to understand that Shakespeare's plays are powerfully musical, but that the musical quality of the plays changes in the course of Shakespeare's career. Many of the early plays, and I think Midsummer Night's Dream is a great example of this, Twelfth Night to a certain extent as well, many of the early plays use music, but also a kind of heightened, almost purple lyric poetry to define character, to advance the plot, and to entertain not just characters in the play, but audiences outside of the play. And so in Midsummer Night's Dream, in particular, there is a soundscape to that play that operates at many different levels. There is the soundscape of the court. There is the playing of the Senate. There would be the horns. There would be the martial music of the court. There is the soundscape of fairyland. There is the music of the fairies. There is Puck's iterative, rhymed couplets. There is the beautiful musical quality to Oberon's speeches. And then there is the music of the rustics. And I think it's immensely significant that the characters who play the rustics, who are going to put on this homespun Pyramus and Thisbe play, almost all of them have sonic names. Flute, snout, quince, bottom. All of them are characters who are artisans, but the names themselves are sonic. And I think what's very important is that Bottom has a beautiful aesthetic to him, so that when Bottom calls for music, he calls for the tongues and bones, which is not courtly music, but is very much rustic music. Now, how can we put this together with the powerful mythology of the play? Because Midsummer Night's Dream, like so many of Shakespeare's plays, is rich with myth. Shakespeare was a great reader of Ovid, and a great reader of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which was the collection of classical myths that in the 16th and 17th century was mined for subject matter, for allegory, and for moral education. So let's go back to mythology. And in Ovid's Metamorphoses, there's the wonderful story of King Midas. Most of us know King Midas because anything he touched turned to gold. But there's another story about King Midas, which is this, that King Midas called upon Apollo, the god of the lyre, and Pan, the demigod of the pastoral, for a musical contest. And Apollo played the beautiful notes on his lyre, and Pan played the rustic notes on his pipe. And Apollo said to Midas, well, which one was better? And Midas said, I have to be honest with you, I liked Pan better. And Apollo was so angry that Midas had chosen unwisely, that he said, well, since you have the taste of an ass, you will have the ears of an ass. And in a magical flourish, he gave Midas big donkey's ears. Now, if you were a student or a scholar at the end of the 16th century, reared on your Ovid, when you saw Midsummer Night's Dream, and when you saw Bottom transformed with the head of an ass, you could not but think of King Midas. And when Bottom calls for tongues and bones, he is living that Midas world. In many ways, this is not just a source for the play. This is the story of what it means to be an artist in a world of royal power. How do you know that Midas is not on the throne? For Queen Elizabeth, for James I, the patronage of music, art, and theater was central to their exercise of power. And if you were Shakespeare or Jonson or any of their contemporaries, the great lutenist John Dowland, or the musicians William Byrd, or famous court painters, the limners, the miniaturists, how do you know that the taste of your ruler would fit with what you did? And I think in many ways, the experience of being an artist at this time was a Midas-like experience. You may think that you're really Apollo, but what happens if the king wants Pan? Midsummer Night's Dream dramatizes that, and it shows us what happens when a group, as it were, under the spirit of Pan, performs for Theseus and Hippolyta, a royal court. And all they do is make fun of him. One of the things that I notice after years of teaching this play is that many of the students feel that the way in which the royals respond to the rustics' performance, they're commenting, they're gabbing, they're making snide comments, is akin to that television show, Mystery Science Theater 3000, where you have the characters watching B and C level science fiction movies and making snide critical comments about them. It's the similar kind of way. And what it does, just as in Mystery Science Theater, in Midsummer Night's Dream, it elevates the audience. You see, there's no better way to make you feel clever than to have someone else put down something and make you feel like, yes, I'm putting it down too. We identify with the critic. Shakespeare's audience came from all strata of society. But when they sit there in the Globe Theatre, watching the royals watching the rustics, and the royals mock or criticize, the audience will identify with them. It's elevating. It's enhancing their self-esteem. For one brief moment, an artisan who paid a penny to stand on the floor of the Globe Theatre can share in the experience of a king. And the power of Midsummer Night's Dream, I think, is ultimately that. It's the power of dramatic art, not just to be beautiful, but to create a community in the audience, and in the process to take you out of your social status or your personal condition and make you all share. That was the wonderful thing about the theater, is that whether you were paying a lot or paying a little, you were the same. You all were brought together watching the theater. And so Midsummer Night's Dream is one of those plays that uses the play within the play to, as it were, instruct or enjoin or teach the audience how to watch something.
So what about music in Twelfth Night? This
Sure.
is a play that famously starts with a reference to music.
If music be the food of love, play on. That's right. And so much about Twelfth Night, in many ways, is about this transformative power of music, of art in general. And I think in many ways, the story behind Twelfth Night is so much about this. One of the things that I like when I teach it is simply to talk about the title, because it's a title that refers to the occasion of the performance rather than to anything inside the play. Right? Twelfth Night does not tell you what's happening within the fiction of the play. It tells you something about how the play was performed. And so, for the modern student, it's analogous to that play within the play with Midsummer Night's Dream. We're part now of that courtly world. And if music be the food of love, play on, it's important to recognize that that is not just a statement. Okay? The first line of the play is very often transformed into an aphorism that anyone can say. If music be the food of love, play on. But the opening line is spoken by an aristocrat. And that's, to me, the point. That whose responsibility, who is charged with the power to command music? Like Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night is a play that asks, what is the place of music in the exercise of power, in the exercise of political rule, and in the exercise of control? Commissioning art, commissioning music, calling for sound. That is in many ways a power move. It's not just a move of aesthetics and beauty. It's a move which says, I can command these.
It's a kind of a stage direction.
Exactly.
He's saying, and then he tells them to stop.
Exactly.
And so we have the sense that he's got the remote control.
He has the remote control, and as in so many of Shakespeare's plays, what Shakespeare is doing is he is dramatizing the power of the director or the stage manager or the playwright to command. Shakespeare may have been the son of a glover, but in the theater, he's the one who can tell you what to say. And I think in so many ways, Twelfth Night is really about that. Twelfth Night is a play that I think many people want to see as a play of surfaces, as a play of beauty, as a play of games, as a play of transformations, as a play of impersonations. And that's all there. But I want to see it as a somewhat darker play, as a play about whose responsibility or whose right is it to tell other people what to do? What is the nature of music, not just in terms of entertainment, but in terms of the commissioning of power. What does music give you? And I want to offer another mythological analogy. Just as I talked about Midas and music in Midsummer Night's Dream, I'd like to say something about Orpheus, who was the great musician of the classical world. And he too figures very prominently in Ovid. And of course, the story of Orpheus is that he was such a magnificent musician that the rivers would stop flowing, that the very stones would come to hear him, and that animals would quiet and form an audience of creation all around him. He was in love with Eurydice, who, having been bitten by a snake, died. And so Orpheus went to the underworld to try to charm Pluto into letting Orpheus bring her back. And Orpheus does such a great job of playing that Pluto, the king of the underworld, says, "You can have her. One condition, trust me, don't look back as you exit, because if you look back, you will lose her forever." Well, what does Orpheus do? He looks back and loses her forever. This is a story about what music can and cannot do at court. You could say that someone was like Orpheus. Shakespeare loves references to Orpheus. Shakespeare's contemporary, the great lutenist and composer John Dowland, was in his own time called the English Orpheus. The challenge with Orpheus, of course, was that he had to play before the king. It was, as it were, an audition. And so much in Shakespeare is an audition. Everyone is auditioning for something else. I like to read the opening singing of King Lear as an open call, as an audition. Bring in the daughters. You are auditioning for the role of good daughter. Speak the speech, I pray you, in Hamlet words. And of course, Cordelia says, I don't want an audition. No, isn't it enough that I love you? No, you have to play the part. And so Twelfth Night is an early version, I think, like Midsummer Night's Dream, of this Shakespearean impulse. It's not enough to be sincere. You have to do sincere. You have to play the role. And music, song, and lyric are the best occasions for playing that role, because they're very self-conscious performances in all the plays. Well, thank you for this opportunity. It's always a pleasure to talk about Shakespeare and to talk about literature, and it's a great honor to be part of anything going on here at the Swan Theater, which I think uniquely in Southern California gives an intimate experience of performance to students and community members alike.
Thanks, Seth. It's been really great having you here.
Thank you.
And I just look forward to more.
Thank you so much.